Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org. From Boundary to Bear Lake, Fremont to Payette, Oahe to Oneida, there are interesting people, places, and histories in all of Idaho's counties. And Idaho Matters wants to share it with you with stories from all 44 counties that make up the Gem State. Email your ideas to idahomatters@boisestate.edu or use the Talk to Us feature in our app, available on Apple and Android, and tune in each weekday at noon for Idaho Matters.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Samantha Wright, filling in for Gemma Gaudette. You're listening to Idaho Matters. In July, we told you that Idaho Governor Brad Little's financial office had sent out a memo letting state departments know he was thinking about possible budget cuts before the 2026 Idaho legislative session. These mid-year cuts in spending are called holdbacks and often happen when revenues fall below expectations and Idaho needs to start trimming expenses to keep the budget in the black. They're not new to Idaho. We've had holdbacks in the past, including as recently as 2020, but Idaho ended the fiscal year last month with a surplus, so we've been exploring why the specter of holdbacks has crept back into Idaho's budget planning. Jason Mercer is the Vice President and Director of Research for the Mountain States Policy Center, and he's also been exploring why holdbacks have re-entered the conversation around Idaho's budget. He's here to tell us more. Jason, thanks for coming back on Idaho Matters.
Hey, Samantha, it's great to be on with you.
Okay, so let's cover holdbacks again real quickly. What is a holdback? This is when the governor thinks about maybe cutting department budgets. Is that an accurate definition?
Yes, you can think of holdbacks in a couple of different ways. The way that the governor's memo went out is more of a budget planning tool. It's whether it's the 2%, the 4%, the 6% potential reductions, the governor is asking agencies basically to do a prioritization of their activities and identify if there was an issue with the revenue collections and the budget didn't balance, what are some options that they would consider. The actual use of a holdback is in Idaho statute. It's a temporary reduction of spending authority. It's an executive order issued by the governor. So it doesn't change the appropriation level. It just kind of changes what an agency is allowed to spend. And this is only allowed up to the point to bring an account or bring the budget into balance. So the governor can't say, I don't like what's happening in a certain area that the legislature's appropriated funds for, so I'm going to reduce their budget by 10%, even though the budget's balanced. You can't do that. It has to be just enough to bring it back in a line of balance. And there's actually an appeal process through something called the State Board of Examiners, which is made up of the governor, the Secretary of State, and the Attorney General, along with the controller as a non-voting member, that if an agency believes a ordered holdback is unjustified or is at a level not warranted, there's an informal appeal process. So that's the official thing that happens with the holdback. But I think that with the governor's memo and what he was doing, kind of got misinterpreted that this executive order was imminent and these reductions were about to occur.
Gotcha. This was, I think, it sounded like when you read the memo that it's more of an exploration. What would it look like if we had to cut 2% or 4% or 6% or something like that? We ended the fiscal year in June with I think it was a $345 million cushion. And according to your research that I read, Idaho has more than $1.3 billion with a B in reserves. So I guess the question comes up, why is the governor thinking about, something like this right now if we have all this cushion?
And that's exactly how I read that memo that came out, as it was a planning tool. And in the context, we have to remember there is a ton happening at the federal level that it has a lot of uncertainty on our economic outlook. There's the situation with the tariffs. There was the question about whether or not the 2017 tax cuts were going to be extended. So there's just a lot of uncertainty about how firm those revenue forecasts are. And that's why the governor and others, I think, across the country are looking at changes happening at the national level and saying we need to be prepared if things go sideways and what our forecast looks like changes. And that's the context of how I read that memo. And I actually, as I was seeing some of the narrative around this memo indicating that there was a budget crisis in Idaho and these cuts were imminent, I was scratching my head because when you look at the balance sheet, and you can think of a budget in different ways. You can say Idaho is spending too much, Idaho is spending too little. But those are kind of political conversations around the priorities of the state and how what level of spending is appropriate. The balance sheet is really kind of the checklist of the state's fiscal health. Can that budget be sustained? And as you indicated, Idaho's balance sheet is pretty envious of a lot of other states. And in particular, we'll compare this with how much better it's looking than our neighbors to the west in Washington. But you indicated a $345 million ending fund balance. That basically means we closed the fiscal year with 6% in our reserve account that wasn't spent, that wasn't allocated.
Mm,
That's a pretty good ending fund balance.
yeah.
Idaho also has an unrestricted general fund reserve of just under $900 million. That's 15%. And that's money that isn't allocated, isn't protected, that should there be a situation could be accessed. But you also indicated there are total reserves. Some of these have some restrictions on them, but the total reserves are $1.3 billion. That's 22%. For context, a healthy reserve is 10%. So we have a lot of capacity should something go wrong to access the reserves before holdbacks would even need to be considered.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's good news. It's good to have a cushion. It's always good to have rainy day funds. We have a lot of rainy day funds. You wrote that there's a false narrative out there that because the governor, mentioned the word holdback, the memo was talking about that maybe Idaho's in financial trouble. Is Idaho in financial trouble? It sounds like we have pretty good cushion, but how are we doing otherwise?
Yeah, so there's no tax structure that's recession proof. There is no revenue forecast that is able to withstand changes in national factors. So you never quite know what's going to be around the corner on your forecast. But as far as what Idaho has adopted in its budget, combined with its reserves accounts and the tools available to manage any type of shortfall, Idaho's in a great position. And this is, again, why you've seen the national recognition from the credit rating companies. This just like you get a credit rating on how worthy you are as an individual consumer, states get credit ratings as well. Are they a good investment? Can they meet their financial obligations? And Idaho actually has the top credit rating for Fitch, which is a AAA rating, particularly because the credit raters have looked at the balance sheet just like I have and said, we state is able to withstand its recent tax cuts. It has various dedicated spending going out for transportation and other things. And with those reserves, it has the capacity, should there be any changes in the economic outlook, to weather that without having to make drastic changes. And I think that when I saw some of the narrative around the holdbacks, again, there was a fiscal crisis, it didn't match what I was seeing in the balance sheet. So I actually called Idaho's administrator of the Division of Financial Management, Lori Wolf, just to see was I missing anything. And she reaffirmed Idaho's in a good position. The holdbacks are in case there's an issue down the road, but it's also the governor submits a budget each year to the legislature. And these holdback exercise allow him to see where are agencies prioritizing their spending, what's the highest interest that they want to make, where are things where if there were not enough resources that you could out reallocate the priorities. It's kind of a budget tool, not only for the current, for building his future budget as well.
You also wrote about that some have said that the May memo came about in part because of tax cuts the Idaho legislature has been passing. Is that a factor? Is that something that should be in this conversation?
Well, so that's again where you're looking at the balance sheet because Idaho, for many years, has been returning more money back to taxpayers versus building that into the spending. And there's that contrast we can draw with Washington about why they're in a different situation than we are. But those reserve levels and those ending fund balances account for that. So when you're looking at every month, there is a revenue for collection for the general fund. And the most recent one we have is for July. The August one will be any day. While there was a reduction of just under 2% in what was anticipated, it's still higher than in the previous fiscal year and the year before that. So revenues are still growing, even if they didn't hit the expected revenue target. And revenue targets are just that. It's, the economics is not an exact science as far as what's going to happen. But when you're seeing your revenues continue to increase, you're seeing those ending fund balances and the reserves. That's where you're looking at Idaho being in a pretty good position.
Well, I know you wanted to talk about possible changes to how Idaho does its revenue forecast. And as you said, revenue forecasts are just that. They're forecasts. It's like a weather forecast. They may say that it's only 15% chance of rain, but you don't know if it's going to rain or not. It might. It might surprise you. But why would there be an idea about possible changing how Idaho's puts together its revenue forecast?
Yeah, one of the benefits of having Mountain States covers multiple states, and we are looking what's happening across the country in fiscal matters as well. And Idaho's a little bit unique in how it does its revenue process because in every other state, that number is determined before any policy bills are adopted or before any budget bills are adopted. You basically have the framework with which you're going to be allocating resources, determining tax levels. Now, I know that that was the goal this year in Idaho, but it didn't happen initially. There was some disagreement between the House and the Senate members on the joint JFAC committee. So that revenue target wasn't adopted till later in session. That really can't happen. That really needs to be one of the very first decisions the legislature make so that everybody knows what the framework is for the fiscal conversation. And hopefully that's a change that's made going forward.
Well, I think this is fascinating. We've got about a minute left. And I think we have not actually said that, it's required. Idaho has to have a balanced budget every year, right? Because isn't it in the Constitution?
Every state except for Vermont. So 49 states require that balanced budget. And this is where the holdback is if the money is not there's not enough, that's where you have the option for the holdback. And the other tool, which we kind of briefly alluded to, is you can access the reserves. So those are you can do a combination of the both, you can do one or the other. And because you've got over that 22% reserve, that's where I don't think you're going to be seeing, even if there was a slight challenge, I think that would probably be where you would go before you would be in holdback.
Wow. We've been speaking with Jason Mercer. He's the Vice President and Director of Research for the Mountain States Policy Center about Idaho's economy and the potential for budget holdbacks. Jason, thanks for the conversation. This really helps.
Thanks, Samantha. Great to be with you.
This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudette.